Hey, everybody. It is the Ask the Educator podcast. This is Kevin Anderson, your host, and with me, as always, Adam Okada. For this episode, we have a special guest. His name is Jhmeid Billingslea. And Jhmeid, it's funny, we were just talking before the podcast how it's a little ridiculous that we haven't already had you on this podcast. So I'm really excited to get into it. I don't know if you recall, but my first meeting with you was actually in a hospital, and we were trying to
Definitely.
help a
I
customer out
remember.
together. Yeah, yeah. So, very cool to have you on as a guest. And the first thing I'd like you to do is just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background. I know there's a lot of people out there who know you, but I'm sure there's probably one or two that don't. So, go ahead and tell them a little bit about yourself.
Elevator version, I was a Navy trained surgical tech and first assistant who fell in love with sterile processing. I kind of went on to teach surgical technology and first assisting. And then I had an offer to start an ambulatory surgery center. And so then that gave me the chance to be in charge of supply chain, the operating room, surgical techs, and the sterile processing. So I had worked in sterile processing throughout my career because in the military, it's the same. It's not any different. So I didn't know anything about the rivalry that I was supposed to know. And so, but it was great because we have kind of some similarities in our background coming from a clinical space and then going to the sterile process. And so I really love that. And this podcast, I'm a big fan of the podcast, so I'm glad to be on here. And just talking about educators, I was able to get almost at every stop that I've been the first educator that they've had. And, like, or if I go to a place and they've had educators, helping those educators realize what they really should be doing. So it's like, this podcast is perfect. So,
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today is the educator position. Because I know when I started 20 years ago, it was almost unheard of that there was a
very,
sterile
very
processing
much so.
educator. It
Yeah.
was the OR usually had one, but SPD usually did not. So that's a relatively new thing. Um, what do you feel like the role of the educator should be? Because there is a lot of overlap and confusion with management and training and those kinds of things. So what do you feel like the role should be?
So hear me out as I go on a little mini rant to say what it shouldn't be. Because I think a lot of times going from hospital to hospital, as we all have the blessing to do, you kind of see it. And there's no standard job description. The expectations are not standard. And then you get to places and you're like, the educator is doing this. So just simply, the educator is not a preceptor. The educator is not a super technician. So, and the educator is not a staff member in production. So those three things kind of encompass kind of what can go wrong on what the educator could be doing. Because not that educators shouldn't be have their hands in any of those pots, but it becomes kind of overwhelming when that's all they're doing because you have a whole department to educate and you're only concentrating on the people in orientation. You have a whole department to educate and you're just the tech that everybody goes to when they have problems. You have a whole department to educate, and all you're doing is you're the most productive tech who's really smart. So I think those are the when you think about what the educator shouldn't do, it gets to what the educator should do. And the educator really should be a quality and safety officer that ensures that whatever our intention, as stated by our goals and our policies and procedures, is really happening. And so that's a difference between it's very difficult to do that and do those other three things. And so when I see educators on that burnout phase or going like, I'm not really sure this is what I want to do. Like if your facility has the educator resign and want to take another job, that means we're doing something wrong. And so, but if you can use your educator as that quality and safety officer type deal, man, you can improve your quality and your relationship with the operating room.
That's really interesting because I have a question that goes a little bit off script now because you've said a couple things now um, that really got me thinking. Well, number one is I formerly managed an SPD that I believe was sort of that medium size facility, if you will, medium sized department. And We did not have an educator. I wore all the hats as the manager. I did have a lead technician, which was nice. He was very good too. I don't want to minimize that. He was very good at running the day-to-day operational, but I did wear many hats, including the educator. And then even when the surgical services director acknowledged that we needed an educator, they provided the OR educator and put that additional responsibility on
Ugh.
them. And so you mentioned almost everywhere you go, you're able to get people to believe and approve an educator position for SPD. So I think it's really important that we kind of pick your brain a little bit about that. Like, what's that process look like? How do you work on justifying that? And I think you might have hinted at it by showing how all of those things can work better for quality and work better for the operating room as well. So I'll let you take it from there.
That's a softball, but it's a very true softball, right? Because a lot of times you have the manager tasked to be the educator or the team lead or supervisor. And again, what Amy ST 79 4.2.2.1 talks about is everybody in a leadership position should be a part of that education program, right? And the educator should be running the education program, not doing the precepting of all the people, right? You got four people who started. Three of them at one time are going to be unsupervised if everybody thinks, because the other consequence that happens is everybody thinks, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me because we have an educator. So they're not helping out in that precepting process. But back to your question, how do you justify the need for an educator? So first of all, um, we have a white paper coming out at Advantage that's going to prove unequivocally that having an educator and delivering education decreases your error rates. And so it's really a patient safety thing because no one comes to work to make a mistake. So every mistake that people make is because they either were rushing through or frankly don't know that step in the process as well as they should. So part of the justification is talking about taking decreasing the errors, decreasing SSIs. Both of those things we've proven unequivocally, and most importantly, increasing the customer satisfaction to the OR. Because I think you and I commented on this post on LinkedIn, Kevin. Somebody was
Mhm.
talking about a customer success representative.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
That's the educator. The educator is the customer success person because they are very much in cahoots with the OR educator and the OR leadership. They should go to every meeting. And so I always say there's steps to it depending on your size, right? So if you can't get an outright educator, if you get your productivity fixed, then you can find some time to carve out for one of your team leads to be the team lead of education or the specialty. You know, when we say your specialty is neuro, your specialty is ortho, your specialty is education. And really, what you want to do is give them a chance to kind of look at podcasts like this, search the internet, stay up on standards, join Amy groups, those kind of things that keeps you at the forefront of technology and techniques, right? Thinking like there's ways of thinking that can get outdated in 2 or 3 years. And all three of us go to hospitals and they're like four generations of thinking behind and they think they're doing it right. So I think having an educator as that almost independent is not the right word, but that unburdened advocate for patient safety. When you think about it that way, it makes a lot more sense. You can guarantee that you're going to have a reduction in errors, reduction in SSIs, and increase in customer satisfaction because ultimately, what those customers think that SPD is doing is almost more important than what SPD is actually doing, right? Because we're working on all these projects, so we're getting this stuff right. But if they don't understand that that's what we're doing, then it's hard. And when you're running the whole thing by yourself as the manager, father, mother, educator, infection preventionist, representative for the OR center core liaison, then something out of that whole ball of responsibility is going to be missed. And education is so important because it's not just that orientation, because sometimes we get so laser focused on orientation and onboarding is that that's all we think of the educator for. When you look at your errors, it's not just going to be the guys on orientation and onboarding that are making the errors. So what are we making the errors? Who's going to do the root cause analysis of that error? Is the count sheet good? Is the tray good? Does it start at point of use in the operating room? Hint, yes. And then as you start developing education and checkpoints and start looking at, because let me tell you, this is a spicy take. This whole myth of we're going to QA all the trays, that's a waste of your time, right? And mathematically impossible. Which trays are your danger trays? Why is this a danger tray? What are our previous proactive reports? What are our reactive reports? How are we going to change that on the proactive side to say every time this tray is done, we're going to do a true QA? Because this is not a QA if I say, Kevin, let me see that tray when you finish. Kevin, like, whoa, 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 let me do this one extra special. A true QA is like, okay, here's the trays that we've had problems with. I'm gonna pull them no matter where they are in the cycle. So, and that's kind of when you the educate when you start going back to what they're not. You can't do those be a super tech or a preceptor for four people on orientation at one time and do that quality side, like the root cause analysis from a quality side. Do we not have the materials that we need? Is it something? Get that vendor in here. All those actions to take because like people misunderstand a quality program. They're like, but we're reporting our IUSS. A quality program is what is a problem that's impacting the patient, and what are the things that we're doing to do it, and then how do we measure that we're doing what we said we want to do. So I just gave you a free thing. That's a quality program. Well, you just talked about all the stuff the manager has to do. The manager cannot do all of that by themselves because it needs to be teamwork, and you have to have somebody has to. I always say it, the educator needs to protect the manager from themselves, and if you're the educator and the manager, you're not protecting yourself from yourself, and not in a bad way, but just somebody has to be the one, and the manager has to manage that educator and go like, listen, Kevin, we cannot buy all new sterilizers because we just had one incident. But it's a give and take because somebody is like, this is all the stuff we need to do for patient safety. The manager is, this is all the stuff we need to do for operations. If you're trying to think both of them, there's going to be a compromise on both sides. But if you can have that educator pushing, 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 then what you'll see is your outcomes, not just the patient outcomes, but your quality of your product are going to improve because you have that person whose sole job is to come in and say, what are we doing wrong?
So,
Yeah, and
Adam,
that's
before you move on to the next question, I do want to take a hot second to kind of illustrate Jhmeid's point here in a real world example, and that is, I can just tell you that what you said is so true in a sense that, if the manager is doing everything, then things are getting missed. And I will say I lived that. As the manager, I remember making a decision to move to take apart laparoscopic instruments because I thought, oh, this is the right thing to do. And so as we start ordering new instruments, we're going to get these take apart ones. And they started coming in and being put into trays before I could get everybody trained right. Like
Mhm.
I thought I checked that box really
Mhm.
well, but then eventually
Including the
I ended
OR.
up, yeah, I found out from the OR, oh, they were complaining their instruments weren't working, and it was because even though they looked like they were together properly, they weren't. And what I ended up finding out was there was a technician on midnights who reproducibly produced errors when she put them back together, and that was not on her, that was on me as the manager and educator. But I believe, if you have an educator or somebody like that, or a quality officer like you're saying is kind of a dual role for this educator, you could check those boxes much more efficiently and
Oh yeah.
prevent that issue from making it to the OR. So I just wanted to share that real life example because I care so much about quality, and I think sometimes people need those real examples to kind of really put the point home. But Adam, I'll pass it back to you. I know you probably even have a story of your own, but I just couldn't help but want to plug that one in there.
Oh, I mean, Jhmeid made some great points there, and that was one of them. The fact that if you're the manager, it's very difficult to prioritize education on top of all of the management responsibilities you have. Because then I remember being a manager and not having an educator. Do I do education? I have this planned, but I also am backlogged where we've got turnovers that need to get done for the afternoon. Maybe I can't. I just don't have time for the education.
Right,
And
right.
that's where those priorities really get
Ugh.
into conflict. And that's why it's good to have a separation, an educator and a manager, because they do have very separate roles. Their priorities are different, right? The
Very much
manager
so.
is running
Very
the department. The
right.
educator is trying to make sure it's run correctly. Those are two very different things. So I love that point there. But let's say you're a new educator, Jhmeid. Let's say somebody's coming in. You're the first time that you're coming into a hospital as the new educator, because I had this responsibility where there was
Right,
no education program. We had no
right.
competencies. We had no training protocols. There were no
Oh, my
preceptors.
God.
People just were thrown into the fire and you had to learn. And that's how I learned too. So as a new educator, what strategies would you try to give them to setting up that new program, or what advice would you give them for coming in cold like that?
So I think a lot of your viewers on this podcast have have been in that situation. And so because to your point, the position is relatively new, right? And so there's probably not an educator in the country that's 5 generations deep, as far as employees, not decades of generations. So
Right.
you use that to your advantage, right? Because they the first of all, the job descriptions are terrible, right? Just in general, because it's not a great model of how to do it. Like, okay, let's see what the OR educators, let's take that stuff. Let's see but it's your opportunity to step to carve out what you want to do. And the first thing is you're not going to turn the mountain around, but what you're going to do is help your manager understand, okay, is this educator job focused on just orientation? So you can provide data and say, here's the errors that we had, right? And it looks like 60% of them are people who are not on orientation, right? So that means we need to beef up our competencies and we need to start delivering education, specific education on the errors we're actually making, right? Like those Healthmark Healthmark education is great to supplement what you have and remind you of what you need to do. But your basis of your education should be the issues that you're facing. So it should be most like a 80-20 rule. Like we can't do this small frat trait. Let's get the rep in here. Let's get one of the surge techs down here to do it. And let's look at the count sheets and make sure those are things. Those are giving you tips, right? Because you can put anything you want on the count sheets. Like people are like, what? Don't want to. The comments section is always bare. But those are the kind of things that I want my educator to do is we do a root cause analysis. And so when you start doing the different things, here's the advice. Don't do it for everything. So you can't go, oh, as the educator, I'm gonna go through every count sheet and put the tips, but do one. And then when your leader sees the difference, so I did a root cause analysis. I was able to look in the instrument tracking system. I was able to do so. You show them kind of one example, right? That you have proof of concept, and you say, "This is what I think the educator should be doing." Not that orientation is not important, but
Mm.
we want to get people oriented. We want to add some classroom time in there. Educators, hello, I'm talking to you. Like you didn't have somebody last week, so you have somebody this week, and now you're counting them in production. What are we going to do if Kevin is not back in decon? What we did last week when Kevin wasn't here. So it's like add some didactic to your education program because you're saying, man, Kevin didn't do a good job of cleaning that cannula. And Kevin is like, what is a cannula again? Because I just saw a bunch of stuff that I called tweezers my whole life, And you're telling me to have specific names and different protocols for testing. So, we go like, well, anybody can work in decon. Can people work in
Mm.
decon if they don't know what the equipment is and the names of some of the basic instruments? So add that as a part of your orientation, and then that'll help you from that simultaneous thing. Try to train people on their shift. So yeah, they had to come in at 9 o'clock for orientation. So don't go, okay, see you tomorrow at midnight. Just go, all right, to next tomorrow 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock next week, 12 o'clock, and then eventually they'll get down to that nights, and you'll get plenty of time with them. But everybody, you shouldn't feel like I can only train the person on my shift, right? Because the challenges of, like Kevin just talked about, the challenge of third shift different from the challenge of second shift, the challenges of first shift. So make sure you do those kind of things, which are different than probably what they were doing, because the most common model is everybody trains on first shift, and the educator's number one job is to train the people on orientation, and we have a high turnover, so they're pretty much constantly training people. And then when they have to go to their regular here's why they have to keep training people. When it's time for them to go to their regular shift, they're like, hey, I don't have any childcare, I can't work third shift. But we hired you for third shift. Well, you just had them on first shift for 3 months or 4 months. So of course they thought, but now they can apply for jobs because you've been doing such a great job. Now they can talk about point of use treatment and the difference between cannulated items and take apart stuff. And they're killing interviews with your education, but not on the right shift. So I say it's like, don't don't try to turn everything around. Find one thing that you can improve and just work off of a play sheet, right? Because here's one thing that somebody like Advantage should work on is there's no if we get ready to get scopes. Kevin says, hey, they're giving me in charge of scopes. How should I get to know more about scopes? Oh, get your CER. Go study for the CER and get the book for the CER. The educator position, there's no certification, there's no handy handbook to say, here's what you should be doing. So a lot of time we're just winging it. So don't criticize the person that was before you. They were probably just winging it too. So just find those things to get them right in that thing. You don't have to ace everybody with all the stuff that's wrong with their policies and practices. Just look at, here's the most dangerous thing. Let's work on that, and then let's move our way down.
I love that. It's so many things in that explanation that that triggered more thoughts for me. But um, yeah, so great examples. One of the things that I thought was interesting was, and how you keep kind of tying this back to quality management and looking at maybe what's the most important thing or what's the most common issue or whatever. And in order to do that, you have to be tracking those things.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I hate it when I go in somewhere and all they're tracking is IUSS, or they take a problem from the OR and write up a technician. Like, this is not how it's done. You should, number one, you should always, always, always know your defect rate. How many defective trays compared to the patients you serve, or the trays that you do that are done correctly. And in addition to that, what types of defects are coming? Is it bioburden, or is it missing instruments, or is it this or that? And as you put those into buckets and you see how often they're happening, or maybe this one problem doesn't happen often, but when it does, the case gets canceled, or there's a huge delay, or whatever. That means, oh, we got a huge priority here, and we can allocate our educator and dispatch them into solving that problem.
Very
And I think that is just incredible. And I love that you pointed out how educators that are maybe new in their role are overwhelmed right out of the gate, and that is so true. And I think that that's why it's so important to just kind of know what your issues are internally so that you can start chipping away. Don't try to, take on the entire iceberg, but just chip away and move the needle slowly over time. But with that, Jimmy, before we close, I wanted to give you the chance to give or share any final thoughts about this position. It's such an important role in sterile processing departments, and love to hear any final thoughts you have on this.
this has been a fun talk that will continue when I see you guys again. I think the simplest way to look at it is don't wait till the educator job comes open to start being an educator, right?
Mm.
Like nobody can stop you from at Huddle going, "Hey, did you guys know there's this new product that's out that can shorten our time from 3 hours to 27 minutes?" Hey, did you guys know? Did you guys? I was watching a podcast and they were talking about educators, how if we're not big enough to have an educator, we can have a specialty check to do education. So I'll be bringing in services to like nobody can stop you for that. And the funny thing is, a lot of times when educators come about, you have the people who have been the least interested in change going, I don't know why they didn't ask me to be the educator. So I think taking that responsibility on, take if you're already an educator, look at this podcast, look at everything. Everything you're not going to agree with, but you have to stay up on the newest technology, the newest thoughts, and standards. One of the things that we all have in common is being on a standards group. And nobody in this world, and I'm talking to you, Dave Jagrosi and Damien, but seriously, nobody knows all the standards. It's just about as you get to know standards, you also know stuff that could never possibly be a standard, right? When people have these myths in their departments. So I think it's part of being an educator is self-educating and then not trying to regurgitate all that education onto your victims, I mean your team members at the staff. So just slowly, like Kevin said, hey, this is our biggest problem. I am going to become, I'm going to look up everything that I can about whatever this problem, whether, like you said, bioburden, missing instruments, uh, um, chemical indicators not being visible, whatever that problem is, you become that expert on that, and then I guarantee you, whether you're the official educator or not, it's going to help your quality in your department. And if you're an educator, start thinking of yourself as a quality officer. Like I'm not just focused on precepting people and orienting people. I'm focused on what do we struggle with as a department. That's what I want to develop education about. And so if you look at it that way, I promise you the results will get there. You'll stop being burnt out. We've all been there. And you'll be able to say, oh, I did an in-service on that trait and it just passed 11 quality audits in a row. Yeah. Those are the kind of things that keep you from burning out and then also translate to better patient outcomes.
Yeah, the great Jhmeid Billingslea. If you're not following him on LinkedIn, you really should be. He's a great follow on there. And Advantage Support Services, great stuff from them. The great Angela Llewellyn, Jhmeid. And Jhmeid, thank you so much for being on the
Thanks for
podcast with
inviting me.
us.
Thanks for inviting me. I had a great time.
All right, we'll see you next time, everybody.